The wind on Halden's Reach had a voice, and after 7 years, Henry Grant knew all its moods. Tonight it moaned low across the empty fields, dragging dust against the walls of the last building with a light still burning inside. Henry sat by that light and listened, because the wind was the only thing on this whole world that ever spoke back to him. He was a big man once, broad in the shoulders from years of farm work. Now his clothes hung loose. His beard had gone grey without him noticing, and his hands, once sure and strong, shook a little when he held his cup. He looked at those hands sometimes and did not know whose they were. Colony Meridian had been home to 300 people. They came to grow food on a fresh world, to build barns and dig wells and raise children under new sky. For a while it worked. Then the blight came. It crept into the soil, turned the crops black, and would not stop. The colony ordered an evacuation. Ships came and took the people away in groups. Henry, the agricultural engineer, stayed to shut the systems down safely and wait for the final ship. That ship never came. A storm, a broken schedule, a mistake in some office far away. He never learned the reason. He only knew that one day there were people, and the next day there were not, and no one ever returned. So he stayed. There was nowhere else to go. Each morning Henry rose before the sun. He checked the one greenhouse dome he kept alive, a small glass room where a few stubborn plants still grew. He watered them. He counted his food. He wrote the date on a calendar he drew by hand on the wall, 1 square for every day. The squares now covered 3 walls. Somewhere along the way he had stopped feeling the numbers. They were just marks. He talked to himself because a silent man forgets how to speak. He talked to the broken comm unit on his table, a black box that had not sent or received a single word in years. He would tap it, wait, and say, "Anybody out there?" Then he would answer himself, "No, just us." And he would laugh, but the laugh always died fast. The pests did not help his mood. The colonists had called them dust dragons, though they were no bigger than a man's hand. They were small flying lizards, the color of sand and old copper, with thin wings and quick dark eyes. They lived in the rocks past the fields. They darted around his greenhouse dome, stealing seeds, scratching at the glass, and generally being a nuisance. Henry chased them off with a broom. He had no love for them. They were just one more thing that wanted his food. That night, as the wind moaned, Henry did something he had not planned. He took a knife, and instead of writing the date on the wall, he carved a single line into the wood of his table. Not a date, just a line. A quiet way of saying, "I am still here," in case anything at all was keeping count. He did not know why he did it. He put the knife down and stared at it for a long time. He was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He was tired of the sound of his own breathing. He was tired of the empty chairs. He had begun to think, in the dark parts of the night, that it would not matter much if he simply stopped checking the dome, stopped watering the plants, stopped waking up. The thought did not scare him anymore, and that was the most frightening part of all. He blew out the light and went to bed with the wind still crying outside. Morning came grey and cold. Henry pulled on his coat and opened the door to begin the same day he had lived 1,000 times before. He stopped. On the flat stone of his doorstep sat a small blue pebble. It was smooth and round, worn shiny by water or time, and it caught the weak morning light with a soft glow. It sat right in the center of the step, as if placed there on purpose. Henry frowned. He looked left and right across the empty yard. Nothing moved but a curl of dust. He crouched, joints creaking, and picked up the pebble. It was cool in his palm and heavier than it looked. A pretty thing, he supposed, but the wind carried all sorts of trash across the fields. A pebble on the step meant nothing. The wind had rolled it there, that was all. He tossed it aside into the dirt and went about his work. But as he watered the plants, his mind kept drifting back. The pebble had not been at the edge of the step, where the wind might push a thing. It had been in the middle, placed. He shook his head. A lonely mind, he told himself, sees meaning in dust because it is starving for meaning. He knew that trick. He would not fall for it. That evening he ate his small meal alone, wrote nothing on the wall, and carved a second line into the table beside the first. 2 lines now, 2 days of simply refusing to disappear. Outside, past the fields, in the cracks of the warm rocks, dozens of small dark eyes watched the building with the single light. They had watched him for years. They had seen him chase them, and they had seen him weep at his own table when he thought no one could see. They had seen the tall creature grow slow and sad and small. And one of them, a young flyer with a torn and crooked wing, remembered a warm hand from a cold day and had decided it was time to say thank you. The wind moaned on, Henry slept, and the eyes waited for dawn. The second gift arrived on a morning so quiet that Henry heard his own heartbeat. There was no wind that day, the world held its breath, and when he opened his door, there it was again, sitting in the exact center of the step. This time it was a shell, a broken half of some small creature's shell, curved and pale, with a faint rainbow shine along its inner edge. It was clean. It had been set down with care. Henry did not toss this one aside. He stood in the doorway a long while, holding the shell, and a cold thought crawled up his spine. 2 mornings, 2 objects, both placed in the middle of the step. This was not the wind. Someone or something was leaving these. For a wild moment his heart leaped with a hope so sharp it hurt. A person, another human, a survivor he had never known about, hiding in the hills, too shy to knock. He shouted into the empty yard, his voice cracking from disuse. "Hello, is somebody there? Please, I'm here, I'm here." His words rolled across the dead fields and came back to him alone. Nothing answered. No one stepped from the rocks. He searched the whole settlement that day. He walked to buildings he had not entered in years, calling out, checking for footprints, for signs of life. He found only dust and old bones of the colony. By evening, his hope had curdled into a strange fear. If not a person, then what? What creature carries gifts to a man's door? He set the shell beside the blue pebble, which he had picked back up from the dirt, without quite deciding to. 2 treasures on his table now. He looked at them a long time before sleep took him. The third morning brought a bright twist of metal, a curl of copper wire polished until it gleamed. The fourth brought a small dark stone shaped almost like a heart. The fifth brought a single perfect feather, though there were no birds on Halden's reach that Henry had ever seen. He could not stand the mystery any longer. On the 6th night, he did not go to bed. He dragged his chair to the window beside the door, wrapped himself in a blanket, and set his gaze on the doorstep. He would catch the giver. He would see with his own eyes. The night crawled by. His eyes grew heavy. Twice he jerked awake, angry at himself. The sky in the east began to turn from black to gray, and then, in that faint first light, he saw movement. Something small dropped from the sky and landed on the step. It was one of the dust dragons, the pests, the vermin he had chased with a broom for 7 years. It moved awkwardly, dragging something too big for its little body, a shining bolt from some old machine. It heaved and pulled, wings trembling with the effort, and slowly worked the bolt into the center of the step. Then it stood back, as if to check its work. Henry pressed his face to the glass, and his breath caught. He knew this one. He would know it anywhere. Its right wing was torn and healed crooked, folding at a wrong angle. He remembered that wing. Months ago, before the gifts began, he had found a young dragon caught in the netting he used to keep pests off his plants. The little thing had fought and tangled itself worse, its wing ripped, its body cold and going still. Henry had almost left it. It was a pest, after all, but something in him, the same something that had kept him watering plants on a dead world, would not let him walk away from a dying thing. He had cut it free with gentle hands. He had carried it inside, warmed it by his heater, and feeling foolish, had shared a crumb of his own dried fruit. He had watched it through the night. By morning it was strong enough to fly, its wing forever crooked but working. He had opened the door and let it go, and he had thought, that is the end of that. He had even given it a name, out of loneliness more than affection. He had called it Bright, for the way its eyes shone. Now Bright stood on his doorstep in the grey dawn, having dragged a heavy bolt across the fields as a gift. Henry's throat tightened. He understood all at once what he was looking at. These were not random pests. This small creature remembered. It remembered the warm hand and the shared food and the gentle release. And in its own way, with the only riches it had, it was saying thank you every single morning. He rose from his chair so fast it toppled. He fumbled the door open. Bright startled and shot into the air, hovering just out of reach, watching him with those shining eyes, ready to flee. Henry did not chase. He did not shout. He knelt down slowly in the doorway, making himself small, and he held out his empty, shaking hand, palm up, the way he had held it that first cold night. "I remember you," he whispered. "I remember you too." Bright hovered, uncertain. Then, in a flash of copper wings, it darted down, landed on the step, and looked up at the big sad creature who had once been kind to it. Henry began to weep, not the hopeless weeping of empty nights, but something warmer, something that shook loose years of dust from his chest. He laughed through the tears, a real laugh, loud and surprised, and the sound rang out across the fields for the first time in longer than he could remember. Bright cocked its head at the strange noise. Then it turned, flew a short distance, and looked back, as if to say, "Follow." Henry, wiping his eyes, stepped out of his door and into the morning. Learning a new language is hard. Learning one with no words at all is harder still. But Henry Grant had nothing but time, and for the first time in years, he had a reason to spend it. Bright led him that first morning to the warm rocks past the fields, and there Henry saw what the colony had never bothered to see. The dust dragons did not live as scattered pests. They lived as a people. Dozens of them nested in the cracks and hollows, sharing warmth, sharing food, calling to one another in soft clicks and trills. Little ones tumbled and played. Older ones stood watch on high ledges. There was order here. There was care. Henry sat on a flat rock at a respectful distance, day after day, and simply watched. He learned that a quick rising trill meant excitement, and a low flat buzz meant danger. He learned that they tipped their heads to listen, that they groomed each other's wings, that when one of them died, the others gathered close and went quiet for a long time before covering the small body with pebbles. They mourned. Henry, who knew mourning well, felt a kinship in his chest that surprised him. He began to bring things to the rocks, not to lure them, but to give the way they gave to him. A warm, flat stone he had heated by his heater, a dish of soft grain, a strip of bright cloth they could line their nests with. At first they scattered when he came near, but Bright always stayed, and where Bright stayed, others slowly grew brave. Within weeks, the little ones would land on his knees and his shoulders, weightless as leaves, tugging at his beard and his buttons. He named more of them. A fat, greedy one he called Barrel, a tiny, fierce one who guarded the young he called Captain. He talked to them as he worked, and though they could not understand his words, they understood his voice, and they answered with trills that rose and fell like a conversation. For the first time in 7 years, Henry's days were full of sound that was not the wind and was not his own lonely echo. But not every dragon welcomed him. There was one, older and larger than the rest, with a body crossed by pale scars and a wing that had been torn and mended many times. The others deferred to her. She led the flight, decided where they nested, settled their quarrels. Henry thought of her as the matriarch, and the matriarch did not trust him one bit. Whenever he came, she perched high and watched him with hard, unblinking eyes. She never took his gifts. She never let the little ones stray too far while he was near. Once, when a hatchling landed on his palm, she dropped from her ledge like a stone and drove it back to the rocks with sharp cries, then turned and hissed at Henry with her wings spread wide. He understood her in a way. This was a hard world. Halden's Reach gave nothing for free. The soil was poor, the storms were cruel, and food was always scarce. In such a place, a creature learns that anything offered freely is a trap. The predator that looks like a gift is the one that eats you. The matriarch had led her people through years of that hard truth, and here was a great tall creature handing out warmth and grain and asking for nothing. To her wise and wary eyes, nothing could be more suspicious. Henry did not push, he let her watch. He kept his hands open and his voice soft, and he waited, the way he had waited for a rescue ship, except this time he was not sure what he was waiting for. Then the storm season came. On Halden's Reach, the storms did not merely blow. They fell like a hammer. The temperature dropped fast, ice formed on the rocks, and winds screamed across the open land, strong enough to knock a man flat. Henry had survived 7 such seasons sealed inside his building. But the dust dragons had only the cracks in the rocks, and the cracks were not enough. He went to the rocks on the first hard night, fighting the wind, and what he found broke his heart. The little ones could not hold their warmth. He saw 2 hatchlings already still and cold, half buried in blowing ice. He saw others shivering, too weak to trill, their tiny bodies failing one by one. The whole flight was slowly freezing, and there was nothing they could do but huddle and endure and die. Henry did not stop to think about food rations or safety or sense. He scooped up an armful of shivering hatchlings, tucked them inside his coat against his own warmth, and stumbled back through the storm to his building. He threw open the greenhouse dome, the one warm glass room he had kept alive all these years, and he laid the little ones down by the heater. Then he turned and went back into the storm for more. He made the trip again and again, all through that terrible night. Each time he came back to the rocks, more dragons let him carry them. His hands went numb. His lungs burned. He gave up the last of his warmth and his strength to save creatures that were not his own, that could give him nothing, that the whole colony had called vermin. Near dawn, exhausted and grey, he knelt in the rocks to gather the last few. And he found the matriarch there, guarding a cluster of the smallest hatchlings with her own scarred body, her wings spread over them against the ice, freezing herself to keep them warm. She looked up at him, he looked at her. He held out his open hands, palm up, the same as always. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, the wary old leader stepped aside and let the tall creature gather her freezing children into his warm coat. She did not understand him yet, but she had seen him carry the dying inside and ask for nothing back, and something in her hard, wise heart had cracked open just enough to wonder. Warmth changes everything. Ask any creature that has been cold to its bones, and it will tell you that heat is not a comfort but a miracle. Inside the glass dome, through the long storm season, that miracle belonged to the dust dragons and the tall man who gave it to them. The greenhouse became a home. Henry moved his few plants to one side and gave the rest to the flight. By day, the dragons sunned themselves under the glass, while the storms howled harmless outside. By night, they slept in a great pile of copper and sand-colored bodies, warm and safe, trilling softly in their dreams. The little ones grew strong, the sick ones healed. Not a single dragon died once the doors were opened, and on this hard world, where death was a season all its own, that was a wonder none of them had ever known. It cost Henry dearly, and he never once complained. He fed the flight from his own stores, splitting his grain, his dried fruit, the careful supplies he had guarded for years. He ate less so they could eat more. His clothes hung looser than ever and his hands shook harder, but his eyes had a light in them that had been gone a long time. He would sit in the middle of the pile of dragons, a hatchling asleep in his palm, and he would murmur, they're now, nobody's going anywhere. And then, one quiet afternoon, Henry saw something that stopped his breath. In the corner of the dome, a hatchling had hurt its leg. It could not push to the food dish with the others. It lay apart, hungry and weak. On a normal day, on the old hard rules of Halden's Reach. That hatchling would have been left to fade. The weak did not eat first. The weak did not eat at all. But as Henry watched, Barrel, the fat greedy one who had never shared a crumb in his life, waddled over to the hurt hatchling with a seed held carefully in his mouth. He set it down in front of the weak one. Then he nudged it closer, making sure it ate. Henry sat very still. He had seen the dragons take. He had never, in all his watching, seen one dragon feed another who could not feed itself. That was not their way. That was not the way of this world. It was his way. It was what they had watched him do, night after storm-lashed night. Over the following days, he saw it again and again. Dragons sheltering their injured under their wings. Dragons carrying food to those too weak to fetch it. Dragons standing guard over the small and the sick instead of leaving them behind. A behavior their whole species had never possessed, a kind of mercy the cruel world had never taught them, was spreading through the flight like warmth through cold hands. And it had started with one lonely man who did not know how to walk away from a dying thing. Henry understood what he was seeing, and the understanding humbled him to his core. He had not merely saved their lives. He had shown them a new way to live. On a world that gave nothing freely, he had taught an entire people how to give. The matriarch understood it too. She had watched all of it from her high perch inside the dome, her hard eyes softening a little more each day. She had seen the tall creature share his last food. She had seen him weep over a hatchling that did not survive its injuries, a creature not even his own, and she had seen her own children learn his gentleness. The wary logic of a lifetime told her that kindness was a trap, but her own eyes told her something her logic could not answer. On the last day of the storm season, when the winds finally died and the sun broke clean over Halden's Reach, the matriarch came down from her perch. She crossed the dome slowly, scarred and dignified, and she stopped before Henry where he sat. In her mouth she carried something. She set it down at his feet with great ceremony. It was a stone, but not just any stone. It was a smooth blue pebble, worn shiny, exactly like the very first gift Bright had ever left on his step. Henry realized with a shock that these blue stones must be the most precious thing the dragons had, the treasure they gave only to their own, only to the ones they loved. The matriarch, who had trusted no one, who had guarded her people against a cruel world for all her long life, was giving Henry her greatest treasure. She was telling him, in the only language she had, that he was no longer a stranger, no longer a suspicious tall thing. He was flight, he was family. Henry picked up the little blue stone and held it to his chest, and he could not speak. When he found his voice at last, it came out rough and low. "You gave me more than you know," he told her, told all of them, the pile of warm bodies watching him with shining eyes. "I stopped counting the days because I wanted them to end. You made me want to see the next one." He wiped his face. "I thought I was saving you. You were saving me the whole time." The dragons trilled softly, and Bright climbed up to sit on his shoulder, crooked wing and all. It was then, in that perfect quiet moment, that the black comm unit on his table crackled. Henry froze. For 7 years it had been dead, silent, a piece of junk he talked to only to hear a voice. Now a light blinked on its face, weak but steady, and a thin thread of sound broke from it, a signal, distant and automatic, sweeping the system. A ship was coming. And Henry, who had prayed for that sound every night for 7 long years, felt his heart fill not with joy, but with a sudden cold dread he did not fully understand. Della Reyes had recovered a lot of dead colonies in her time, and she expected this one to be no different. Log the site, count the losses, retrieve any remains, file the report, move on. Halden's Reach was just another failed dot on a long list. She brought her small survey ship down through the clearing skis with a pilot's steady hands and a tired heart, expecting to find nothing but bones and dust. She did not expect the door of the last standing building to open and a living man to walk out. He was thin and grey, and his clothes hung off him like a scarecrow's, but he was alive, shading his eyes against the light of a ship he had waited 7 years to see. Della's crew of 4 stared in plain shock. Dead colonies did not have survivors, not after this long, not alone. They rushed him inside their ship, wrapped him in blankets, pressed food and water on him. Henry took it all in a daze, half laughing, half weeping, touching the faces of real people as if he could not believe they were solid. He talked in a flood, 7 years of silence pouring out at once. He told them about the colony, the blight, the ship that never came. And then he told them about the dragons, and the crew went quiet, and Della's tired heart grew wary. "There are creatures here," Henry said, gripping her arm. "Small ones, they're intelligent. They save each other now, they gave me a reason to live, their family. When we leave, they come with us. Do you understand? I'm not leaving without them." Della had heard survivors say strange things before. Years alone did things to a mind. She spoke gently, the way you speak to the sick. "Let's get you strong first," she said. "We'll sort out the local wildlife." That word, wildlife, put a stone in Henry's stomach. The trouble came the next morning. Della's crew went out to survey the site, and they found the greenhouse dome full of dust dragons, dozens of them, swarming the glass, darting through the open doors. To the crew's eyes, it looked like an infestation. One of them raised a device that clicked and beeped, scanning, and frowned at the reading. "Native fauna," he called out. "A lot of them. Protocol says we clear the area before we move the survivor. Could be a contamination risk." Henry heard the word clear, and he knew exactly what it meant. He had read the same protocols long ago, when he was young and the colony was new. Native fauna near a recovery site was to be removed, exterminated, wiped out before it could follow a ship into human space and spread who knew what. It was standard. It was procedure. It was, to Della's crew, simply the correct and careful thing to do. Henry threw himself between the crew and the dome. "No," he said, and there was iron in his weak voice. "No, you will not touch them." Della came to calm him, and he turned on her, eyes blazing. "You call them wildlife. Let me show you what they are. Just look. Give me 1 hour and look before you kill anything." She almost said no. Protocol was protocol, but there was something in the man's face, something so certain and so fierce that she found herself nodding. 1 hour, she said. So Henry showed them. He knelt in the doorway of the dome and held out his open hand, and the dragons came to him. They landed on his arms and his shoulders and his head, trilling, nuzzling, plainly glad to see him. He called them by name and they answered. He showed the crew the hurt hatchling in the corner, and he showed them Barrel bringing it food, one creature feeding another who could not feed itself. He showed them the pile of blue stones the dragons had given him, their treasures, their love made solid. He showed them a wing being groomed, a quarrel being settled, a small body being mourned under a cover of pebbles. The crew, hardened people who had seen 100 dead worlds, went silent. The one with the scanner slowly lowered it. This was not an infestation. This was not wildlife. This was a people. They didn't always do this, Henry said quietly. The feeding, the saving, they learned it. They learned it from watching me, a stupid old man who couldn't leave a dying thing alone. His voice shook. I changed them, and they changed me. You can't put that in a report and then wipe it out. Della stood there a long time, and the pilot in her wrestled with the human in her. Rules existed for good reasons, but rules had also once left a man to rot on a dead world for 7 years because a schedule failed and no one looked twice. She knew, better than most, what it cost to follow a rule past the point of sense. She never got to finish the thought. One of her crew, nervous, took a step toward the dome with his device raised, and the flight read the motion as a threat. In a heartbeat, the air filled with the buzz of danger, and dragons scattered up in alarm. And the matriarch dropped from the top of the dome like a falling star. She landed on the ground between the crew and Henry, between the weapons and the man she had claimed as family. She was small, scarred. No bigger than a hand, facing armed giants 100 times her size. She spread her torn wings as wide as they would go, lifted her head, and hissed a challenge that trembled with fury and fear both. She did not run. She planted herself in front of Henry and made herself a shield, ready to die for him, the way he had once nearly died for her people in the storms. The crew froze. The little scarred creature stood her ground, wings spread, daring them. Slowly, one by one, the crew lowered their guns. And Della Reyes, watching a hand-sized dragon offer its life for a human being, understood that her report was going to be very, very different from the one she had come to write. A report is a small thing. A few words, a few numbers, sent across the dark to an office where tired people read 100 like it every day. But the right words at the right time can change the path of a whole world, and the words Della Reyes wrote about Halden's Reach were the right ones. She did not write about wildlife or contamination. She wrote about a people. She described the dragons who fed their weak and mourned their dead and gave their treasures out of love. She described how their kindness was not born in them, but learned from one stranded human who refused to let dying things die alone. She wrote that this world held a thinking, feeling species standing at the very edge of something greater, and that the change in them could be traced to a single act of mercy repeated 1,000 times. She staked her name and her career on every line. The office was quiet for a long time. Then the answer came back, and it was not the answer she had feared. Halden's Reach was declared a protected world. No colony would strip it. No crew would clear it. The dust dragons were named a species of interest, to be studied with care and respect, and never again to be called vermin. And the man who had taught them mercy was given a choice. Henry could leave. He could board Della's ship, return to human space, sleep in a real bed, eat until his hands stopped shaking, and live out his days surrounded by his own kind. After 7 years of aching loneliness, no one would have blamed him for taking it. Della offered it to him plainly, expecting him to weep with relief and pack his few things. Henry looked out the window of the ship at the greenhouse dome, where 100 copper wings caught the light, and he shook his head. I spent 7 years praying to leave this place, he said, and then it stopped being a place I was trapped in. It became home. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw him not as a broken survivor, but as a man at peace. "They're my family. You don't leave your family to sleep in a nicer bed. I'm staying." So Henry stayed, but not as a prisoner of a dead world. He stayed as its first caretaker, the human liaison to the people of Halden's Reach. Supplies came now, real ones, sent with respect. Researchers came too, quiet, careful ones who asked Henry's permission before they came near the flight, and who learned the dragons' names from the old man who knew them all. The colony that had failed as a farm was reborn as something better, a shared home, run on the dragons' terms, in partnership rather than conquest. Henry grew strong again, his hands steadied. The grey never left his beard, but the light never left his eyes. He spent his mornings among the warm rocks and his evenings in the dome, and he was never, ever alone again. Bright rode on his shoulder wherever he went, crooked wing and all, and the matriarch, older now and slower, would sit beside him in the evenings while the little ones tumbled and played, the two of them keeping a comfortable, wordless watch over the flight they both loved. The years passed gently. New hatchlings were born who had never known the hard old ways, who had never seen a world where the weak were left to fade. They grew up in the warmth of the dome, fed by their elders, sheltered and safe, learning kindness not as a strange new lesson, but as the simple, ordinary truth of how their world worked. They would never know how it had been before. They would only know the mercy the tall creature had taught their kind, passed down now from dragon to dragon, generation to generation, long after anyone remembered where it began. And every single morning, without fail, the treasures still came. One bright dawn, many years on, Henry rose as he always did. His step was slow now, his beard fully white, but his heart was full. He crossed his room, past the wall of hand-drawn calendar squares he had never painted over, past the table with its two lonely carved lines he had never added a third to, because after that morning long ago, he had never again needed to remind the world he was still here. The world knew, the world loved him. He opened his door and looked down at the flat stone of his step. There, sitting in the exact center, catching the soft light of the rising sun, was a small blue pebble, smooth and round, worn shiny, glowing faintly. It had been placed with great care by a young hatchling who had left it there before dawn and flown home to the rocks, a hatchling who would never know a single cold and lonely night, who did this not to say thank you for a past kindness, but simply because giving was what her people did now. It was who they were. Henry bent down, slower than he once had, and picked up the little blue stone. He turned it in his old fingers, and he smiled at the memory of the very first one, the one he had once kicked into the dirt on a hopeless grey morning, back when he was the loneliest man in the whole wide galaxy. He was not that man anymore. He had not been for a long time. Somewhere in the warm rocks, 100 voices trilled to greet the sun. Bright stirred on his shoulder. The matriarch lifted her scarred old head, and Henry Grant stood in his doorway in the golden light, holding a treasure in his hand, surrounded by a family that had once had no name for kindness, and now had no name for anything else. The loneliest man in the galaxy had become the most beloved. And every dawn, forever after, the treasures still came.